All right.
Okay, nice. So yeah, as you know, I'm going to present a little bit about the circular economy research that I've been doing here at Utrecht University with the Cresting project, which is this Horizon 2020 EU-funded project I'm working on as part of my PhD research. And essentially, since there's only 4 of us, we can, you know, feel free to interrupt me, feel free to ask questions in the middle of the way. You know, we don't have to make it a just presentation and then questions, you know, if you have something pops up, just, you know, throw it out. Cool, so I'm just gonna share my screen so you can see my presentation. Let me know if you can see it. So I guess, yeah.
Yeah, it's perfect.
Great. So basically my presentation will be on the diverse discourses of circular economy and society and kind of looking at the history of the concept and where it comes from. So maybe first, what is the circular economy in the first place, the circular economy discourse? And prior to this, maybe asking you, do you know, or rather, how familiar are you with the term circular economy?
I'm honestly not Anika here, but I honestly just got to know about it when I saw the announcement, which is why I'm here, so I can learn a little bit more.
Okay, cool. How about you, Elaine?
I heard about this for a number of years now, but definitely think that it's an amazing idea and it's what we need to do, but not sure about how it's practically looking like. So curious about that.
Okay, cool. And you, Sarah?
Yeah, I think I have definitely like engaged with the topic a bit throughout my bachelor's, but I'm very excited to hear a bit more about the historical perspective and just how the term has evolved and what kind of different discourses there are around it, because yeah, I wouldn't be able to like, except for the kind of discourse that I've heard of it. Yeah, I don't know what other discourses exist.
Okay, cool. Well, that gives a good glimpse of the level. Well, yeah, we basically have people from all ranges of knowledge on the topic here. So I'll try to go into detail a little bit so that everybody can kind of get a gist of what circular economy is. So it might take a bit longer. Anyhow, just if I'm not clear on anything, just let me know. Essentially, the circular economy is an idea that rised into prominence quite like a lot, essentially, in the last 10 years, and is now pretty much part of almost any discussion on sustainability, especially in Europe and in China. The idea was first coined, like the concept circular economy, perhaps somewhere in 1989 by a book on industrial ecology, but it completely grew out of that initial concept and kind of became a thing in and of itself, especially when China around 2003 made circular economy an essential part of its 5-year plan. And since then, China has been one of the most important kind of proponents and kind of implementers of this concept. Since then, a lot of other practitioners also took on the concept, especially in the business case, you know, in order to develop new business models that are sustainable, green technologies, and etc. And this therefore brought the concept more towards being developed in the practitioner world, you know, of practice, rather than in the academic world, even though that's where the concept kind of originated in a book. Yeah, it kind of essentially can be resumed to an economy where resources, both material and energy resources, are circulated sustainably, efficiently throughout the economy. in order to essentially prevent any resources from becoming a waste, and optimizing the value of every product, every service, every bit of material possible to make sure it doesn't become waste. And if it does, then that waste can be reutilized as a new product for something else. So it's actually creating a cyclical flow of materials. And this applies also to energy, because it's also the idea that renewable energy is, by its very essence, circular, as opposed to fossil energy that obviously once burned dissipates into the atmosphere, or through pollution, essentially. Essentially, the circular economy, through this concept that we can, take waste and reuse it, and also extend the life cycle of our products, of our buildings, it has been seen as a way to cure quite a lot of the big challenges that we have now in the 21st century. Obviously, resource scarcity, as it extends our efficient use of limited material resources, especially limited minerals, such as copper, gold, and silver, that will become scarce in the near future. It also is, of course, a key contributing to climate change mitigation, through renewable energy, also to food scarcity, as it also seeks to recycle organic flows of materials back into the earth. So there's now obviously a rift as we consume food, and it then usually ends up going into basically landfills, or is not brought back to the earth in one way or another. So the circular economy also wants to create a circular agricultural cycles where agricultural, food waste essentially is brought back to the land. And obviously it's also a cure for a lot of the unemployment and economic stagnations that we can see now, as all of this new developments in green technology can bring about quite a lot of innovation, essentially, in a lot of many areas. However, it is facing quite a bit of crucial challenges in order to deliver on these high expectations. There are two main challenges, or rather limitations to, I would say, the mainstream circular economy discourse. The first one is that there has been so far pretty much a lack of a social and political dimension to this talk about these resource cycles and sustainable flows. This means that there has been very little talk and discussion, both in practitioner world and in academic world, about the distribution of costs and benefits. Who pays for these new technologies? Who controls these new technologies? Who, both in the global north and south, is going to benefit from it? And also within countries, what kind of groups are benefiting and not benefiting from it? And there's also very little talk about the governance of it. Who decides what policies are done, who decides what technologies are implemented and which ones are not, and how will that impact the lives and the futures of millions of people? It's very much out of the current question, which focuses instead really on the technology of the circular economy. What kind of practical solutions can we do for businesses, and etc. So the second limitation is that there's often, through this circular economy discourse, an assumption that we can decouple economic growth from environmental degradation. Now, essentially, this means that we can continue economic growth while reducing environmental impacts. And this assumption is brought through this very idea of a circular flow, right? You take materials to the economy and you continuously renew them throughout various efficient economic processes that maintain resources at high value, etc. In reality, though, there are key limitations to this. First of all, it's impossible to create a perfect circle because materials degrade in quality and quantity each time they're cycled and have an inevitable expiration date. So essentially, attempting to kind of focus on a perfect cycle is quite impossible, essentially. And so at some point, some waste will happen. And when that happens, you need to increase the economy in order to supplement for the materials you would have lost. And essentially, scientific evidence from around the world has shown that it's basically impossible due to the biophysical limits of both the energy cycle and the material cycles to decouple economic growth from environmental degradation. Sorry, Sarah, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering, maybe you're even coming with this at some point, but is the circular economy discourse always connected with the idea of growing economically, or has there also been other approaches that maybe combine the circular idea with like not necessarily growing economy?
Yeah, that's a very good question, actually. Right now, I'm really focusing on the mainstream kind of discourse of circular economy. So the one that is promoted mostly, that you would see in policy arenas most of the time, and in business cycles most of the time.
Okay.
This obviously is not the case all the time. So a lot of academics actually take a very different approach to circular economy, and they're very much aware that decoupling economic growth from environmental degradation is not something that is a possibility. And same with social movements around the world. A lot of them are very much aware of this, but they're still nevertheless pushing for some form of circular economy, because there are still many benefits that can be brought from it, but not a growth-centered one, obviously.
Okay.
So yeah, it's something that you would see in the mainstream approach, but yeah, not in all approaches.
All right, and if you are basically cycling resources, and I mean, I'm not sure if this is an assumption, but let's say that you have a set number of resources that you're cycling. How would you be growing economically in this sense? First, if there's always some kind of loss of value, how can you always create more value unless you decide to add more resources to the cycles and extract, but then you're not being very circular, right? I mean, yeah, just
yes.
thought.
Well, that's an essential part of the hypocrisy of this entire idea of a circular economy, right? So, for example, you have companies like Apple that say, "Hey, our product is super circular, like a new computer. It's like fully recyclable, so it's completely circular." What they don't tell you, or even, for example, Coca-Cola is really pushing this with its PET plastic, single-use plastic bottles, saying that, oh, they're super sustainable because they're made of recycled content, and PET is sustainable and can be circulated infinitely, and it's amazing. So please throw your bottle in the right place, right? The reality is that plastic still degrades through time. And you can only recycle PET so many times before it becomes basically unusable. Moreover, a lot of PET, once it's recycled, it uses so many properties that it's not very much usable for food consumption. But some technologies do allow you to do it. So, let's give them the advantage that it's possible, especially for PET bottles. It's one of the easiest things that we can recycle, at least in the plastic world. So it is possible. The thing is, it still degrades through time. So after a certain number of recycling processes, you would lose material, or you won't be able to recycle it in a bottle. And there you'd have to add virgin plastics. So it's impossible for a bottle to be 100% virgin all the time. 100% recycled content all the time, unless you have other people not using that plastic for other purposes, right? If you're one company, it's easy because, but at a wider scale, at some point, your plastic is not going to end up in a recycled product, rather somewhere else. Sorry, do you have a question?
So
no, Yonika.
Yeah, me. Hi. Is there so when I hear the word sustainability, and businesses it's like a buzzword now. Every single business that you say is just like, we have sustainable packaging. This is sustainable, that is sustainable. Is there no strict definition for what sustainability means for one product? Because you mentioned that at one point this PET will degrade and then you have to introduce virgin plastics again. And it just completely defeats the purpose, right? Because you're just delaying the entire
you're
delaying
essentially. Yeah.
So it's just, isn't there some sort of like definition or like some sort of rule for this? Like, I don't get it.
I'm not sure if there's a specific definition. To be honest, I think this is, same with sustainability. Sustainability is what we would call, or in academia, essentially contested concept. It's a concept where there are many very different visions or ideas or discourses about what it means. And these discourses are, in the public arena, fighting each other to see who becomes dominant. And obviously, the powers that be that have the most resources and capacity to spread their voice about a specific concept have more possibility of having their vision of that concept become dominant. So, for example, now there is this proposition of sustainability, right? That the kind of usual idea of what sustainability includes are 3 Ps or 3 elements, right? People, planet, profit. Right. However, those 3, it's a bit contested, right? Like, why those 3? Why people, planet, profit? Why not people, planet, prosperity? Or why not people, planet, and participation? Or for that matter, it also pretends that those 3 are equally important. However, without a planet, you don't have many people, and you have even less profits. Also, how much of an essential human right is it to have profit? How do you put profits at the same, conceptual importance, moral importance as planet and people? And are profits also just part of people? Why are they a different thing? So all these things, all these assumptions that we take for granted when we talk about these concepts are pretty much the result of discursive debates, fights between different ideas and visions and conceptions of this term called sustainability. And what results from it is kind of like the mainstream proposition, right?
I see. Okay.
So, but we always have to question it. So, I mean, at the end of the day, I don't think if the solution is to say, oh, this is the right definition, because it's always a case by case basis. If you take a product, for example, like a bottle, it might be best that we all use reusable and returnable containers with a kind of, system where you get a fee, you pay a bit for the container, and then you return it, you get that money back, or you reusable one where you can bring it back and refill it. It can, maybe that's more sustainable, but you also have to consider other elements, and it's always something that you have to see in a case by case manner. On top of that, having one definition might also inherently limit others. So I think to me, it's more valuable to think about a plurality or a diversity, and to kind of acknowledge that diversity and that concepts are not, should grow, should have the space to grow and to be contested.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't. Well, that's how I see it, at least. Anyways, let's carry on. Unless you have further questions about decoupling or. Okay, cool. So essentially, the problem with this vision, mainstream vision of CE, of circular economy, is that it's deliberately kind of vague, depoliticized, uncontroversial, and it's very easy to get widespread support with such discourse, because obviously it's appealing to a wide range of political actors from right and left, and it's appealing to large companies that can see within the circular economy avenues for new business models and new profit avenues that they can at least frame as sustainable or circular without necessarily really being sustainable or circular when you look at the data. So essentially, very often it's used kind of as a narrative to propose this kind of fairy tale that we can grow on forever as long as we throw our things in the right. It's kind of a greenwashing kind of discourse. However, this is pretty unfair to the concept, to be honest, because if you look at the history, the diversity of the circular economy in its origins, it's quite different from what it's become, at least at the mainstream level, right? And so I'm just going to take you very quickly through some of the history. that originated the circular economy concept. So basically, circular economy, just to start, is nothing new. And really, we've been circular. Human societies have been circular since the dawn of humankind. We've only, we've always recycled all our resources and only used as much as we really needed in traditional societies. And it's only with the Industrial Revolution and the rise of industrial capitalism specifically that we created a system where we overconsumed the natural boundaries of the earth, essentially, and started to spread beyond nature's capacity to hold us, essentially. And that is when also there starts to be a growing movement that calls against this rising destruction of the biosphere from academia and from social movements. And some of the first kind of forms that you can talk about a circular economy is actually Gandhian economics from India, with the concept of the economy of permanence that was coined by Kumarappa in a book in 1945 called The Economy of Permanence. Basically, it's one of the first ideas of sustainability that was conceptually coherent that we can trace back at least in the 20th century. Of course, we can find earlier visions, but I think this one is worth talking about, because that's what sustainability is about, right? A permanent economy, right? An economy that can sustain itself forever. And he proposes that through, of course, local, very participatory, very ethically and morally fair communities working together for kind of their mutual prosperity and kind of equally sharing the planet's bounties in the sense of through organic and agriculture and traditional production processes. So yeah, but the first one to use the kind of metaphor of a circle to talk about the sustainable circular flow of resources is Barry Commoner with the book The Closing Circle. This was published in 1971, and him, from an eco-socialist perspective, kind of develops this society where there is a fair distribution of the resources and material cycles of the earth in order to sustain human society forever within the limits of the biosphere. Another key book in these early stage of circularity thinking is The Limits to Growth, which is quite well known in the sustainability world. It was a very important book because it was one of the first that put data through complex model techniques to show clearly that if we continue growing our economy, we will face a collapse of human civilization, and that we must change our trajectory quite substantially and reduce our consumption of resources in order to basically maintain life on planet Earth. Then you also have a lot of other books that arose in this period, which is basically the 70s, which all propose a more socially just proposition of a circular future. And Small is Beautiful is also one of them. It was written by Schumacher and is based on Gandhian and Buddhist philosophy to construct an economy that is fair and sustainable. Also, you have steady state economics that rose here that is worth mentioning. And in that same period, you also have other types of books that are very aware of the limits of the biosphere and the limits of planet Earth. However, they don't have so much of a social justice element, but rather of a let's take like hands-on, top-down, big control over a population and kind of from a very technocratic point of view, stop the destruction of the earth. And those are, for example, the population bomb and overshoot, which are less socially inclusive. But essentially the 70s is where the growth of the sustainability imaginary as we know it really emerged, and circularity and various concepts related to it emerged as well. And the metaphor of the circle as well, obviously, with The Closing Circle by Barry Commoner, and that of a permanent economy as well, with the Economy of Permanence in Gandhian economics. Later on, during the 80s and 90s, this myriad of views kind of subdued into more market-based and eco-efficiency-based approach to the problems. So this is also a moment where neoliberal economic thinking was quite predominant and was dominant in the ideology, and therefore market-based approaches to ecological problems was seen as the best solution at the time, at least for a lot of thinkers, right? So in this time, you see a lot of new ideas such as industrial ecology, industrial metabolism, and biomimicry, which form an important contribution to the technical side of what a circular economy is about. And essentially, they take inspiration from the way that nature works and does take metaphors from nature, such as industrial ecology, industrial metabolism, and apply it to industrial processes in order to create industrial systems that can reuse their wastes and more efficiently deal with materials and energy. So it was, however, a more depoliticized moment. So there's very little talk about social equity, very little talk about participatory emancipation. And it's much more of a technical approach to the problem. This lasted basically until the early 90s, beginning of the 2000s, well, late 90s, beginning of 2000s, where a new holistic social economic approach to resources, consumption, and waste kind of evolves through a new set of thinking with new books such as Natural Capitalism, approaches like Cradle to Cradle, or the Blue Economy, but you also have many others there. And essentially all these new approaches that start in the 20s really build on this idea of sustainable development to create a society where material and energy cycles are fairly distributed and not only just efficient. So the social aspect is brought forth again, but however, there's still a focus very much to continue economic growth still during this stage. And it is only later in the 2008 onwards that there's more transformational visions that are brought forth and that are more similar to the early precursors to the circular economy. And these are more skeptical about the possibility of continuing economic growth in a finite planet, but are also very socially inclusive and have a big commitment to democracy and participation. There you see, for example, Degrowth with Farewell to Growth of Serge Latouche, one of the most important books in the degrowth movement. You also see a resurgence in eco-socialism. You have other concepts like voluntary simplicity that rise to the agenda, all this from the global north, but also, quite importantly so, from the global south, with contributions from the Latin America, from El Buen Vivir in Latin America, which comes from indigenous traditional thinking. You also have concepts like the pluriverse or ecological svaraj, which is from ecological svaraj is from India. The pluriverse is kind of an idea of how all these different concepts from the global south kind of emerge in a tapestry of alternatives. So basically, all these also contribute to our thinking about what a circular future and circular society can be about and is about by bringing back the elements from the economy of permanence and the limits to growth in a more transformative manner. So essentially, this is the history. Now, how can we kind of divide this into different discourse types in circular economy literature? So after reviewing all this literature, I basically established this circular discourse typology that divides these discourses based on two elements, which are the two basic limitations of mainstream circular economy approaches that we talked about in the first slide. The first one is whether they have a holistic or a segmented approach to social and political considerations. So holistic ones include social considerations, and segmented ones focus only on technical economic approach. And then the second way to divide it on the y-axis is whether they have an optimist or a skeptical belief regarding the possibility of decoupling economic growth from environmental degradation, right? And as we've seen, some approaches are skeptical and others are optimistic about this possibility, despite the science that might say other things. And essentially, if we look at the discourse that this creates four discourse types. There's the technocentric circular economy, which is the mainstream circular economy approach right now, that doesn't focus on social aspects and is quite optimistic about technology. You have there concepts like biomimicry or industrial metabolism, which really focus on the technical aspect of the crisis, but just don't really mention social equity and participation and democracy and all those things, and are quite optimistic about the possibility that technology could save. Then in the top left, you have reformist circular society. And here you have discourses that are holistic in terms of adding a social dimension, but they're still quite optimistic about technology. And there you have cradle to cradle, natural capitalism, and the like. And on the bottom left, the transformational circular society discourses where you put degrowth and buen vivir. And then on the bottom right, you have fortress circular economy, which are those approaches that acknowledge that the earth is limited and that technology will not save us, but that don't really have a very prominent social approach and therefore propose more top-down population controls and technocratic solutions, such as the population bomb and overshoot. So this is how we can kind of understand that myriad of times, and you can also see that through time there is a kind of dominance of different approaches. You know, at the beginning in the 70s, transformational circular society was the dominant. Then as we get into the 80s, 90s, and still nowadays, the technocratic circular economy becomes dominant. Yeah, so through time, different concepts emerge. Now just final reflections. Basically, as you saw, I made a distinction between circular economy and circular society. Well, with circular society discourses being those that not only want to sustainably manage materials, energy, and resources, but also want to create equitable and fair cycles that redistribute wealth, power, technology, and knowledge in an equitable manner, right? So it's not just about circulating materials sustainability, it's about circulating wealth, power, technology, and knowledge, and redistributing that in the economy, right? And that really makes the difference between the concept of circular economy and circular society, or if you wanted, also holistic or segmented discourses. But it's another way to see the difference. Right? Essentially, most of the academic concepts that I introduced were in the long list. I didn't introduce all of them, but they were all written there. 70% of them were in the circular society group. So they include social aspects. However, if you look at circular economy definitions, I was looking at 120 circular economy definitions from basically the literature. Most of them come from practitioners. Others have been brought by academics, but 80% of them nonetheless are based in circular economy, so technocentric approaches. And I would say that the circular economy discourse, as it is now, through this lens that kind of decides to not talk about social aspects, is what can be called a failure of the imagination. A thinking like Thatcher was trying to put in the 80s through neoliberalism, that there is no alternative, like there is no other system than the current system. And therefore, only technology can save us, because unfortunately, our current system is addicted and necessitates growth in order to replicate itself. Capitalism cannot function without economic growth. Therefore, any proposition of a degrowth-oriented circular economy or society has to be a post-capitalist one, but we don't want to look at there. We don't want to look there because we've been so colonized by this imaginary that there is no alternative to the current system, that we can't think beyond that. And I think that has pretty much is witnessed in the academic literature, and especially the practitioner literature on the topic. And I think in order to deal with it, we need to basically decolonize the imaginary, as Serge Latouche would say from the degrowth literature, which means basically opening up our worldviews and allowing ourselves to think beyond our current system towards what Escobar would say a pluriversal imagination, where we can understand that there are multiple ways to understand this, and that thinking within the boundaries of the system might not be enough in order to address the monumental scale of the problems that we have to address. Right, so I have a few questions for you now. So what circular discourse type do you find most appealing? Which ones do you find the least? Which one do you think would likely dominate in the future? Do you find even that the metaphor of circular economy and society is appealing or even useful or necessary, or is it just making things messy, creating a fairy tale? And should we try to transform the concept, or should we just reject it altogether?
I can start.
Of course. Please.
Yeah, personally, I find the transformative circular economy discourse the most appealing.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the when we viewed one, the degrowth one, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Like, but that's because I don't know. I like think that the more segmented part just leaves out a very essential part of society, which social equity is just very important in this whole also more environmental topic, I think. And yeah, at the same time, I just don't really see a sustainable future if we keep holding on to a growth paradigm, basically. So in that sense, it is the most appealing to me. The least appealing would probably be everything that was on the right of the, but like, I really don't like the population bomb and this kind of discourse where basically you're implying that there's too many people in the planet, and for us to be well, maybe some people have to die or something. Like, I don't know, like sometimes I feel like there's this very scary discourse that comes out of that, because like, and especially I noticed it even from some of my friends, that they would be like blaming people in Africa for making like 8 children or something, and that's where the issue is. And I'm just like, what? I don't think that's the issue at all. Like, why don't you start maybe looking at who has historically produced these issues and turn your attention away from the global south to yourself and your like countries where you grew up in. Well, anyways, but then yeah, I don't know, should I go into the next questions already, or maybe we can hear from some other
maybe
people?
Someone else wants to add their, what do you think?
So I like to agree. So like everything on the right, it didn't, like, I couldn't even find, I just hated it. I don't know how else to explain it. I didn't like it at all. But what irritates me is that like that is what everybody else thinks. Like in this very business driven, capitalistic, profit seeking world, they're just like, no, I want that. Like, it's like, I find it very annoying that people think that there's like a balance sheet quality to this. Like, I can keep growing my business, but as long as I support some developmental projects somewhere in India, everything will be fine. It's not like a plus minus. It's not like a balance sheet, is it?
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't like anything on the right. And so I've read some of Ashish Kothari's works as well. So, and I really liked them, and I was trying to remember like what I'd read, and if I could recall anything and relate it. but I hadn't actually ever even heard about circular society. And then, you showed that part where there's power, wealth, knowledge being given back rather than just taking and then like dumping it back, which doesn't really make sense. So I really liked that. Yeah.
Elaine, do you want to add some thoughts?
I think I really like the presentation about that dichotomy, not dichotomy, but then more like typology of fragmented thinking and holistic thinking. But I would see myself being a more skeptical side of it, like in a spectrum, because I am not sure how it is possible economically, as well as, let's say, resource, as well as socially, how to close that loop. And I agree that probably is a lack of imagination, but let's just take materials kind of perspective or energy perspectives. You were also mentioning before, like how the rhetoric was kind of trying to mask the actual complexity of the issue. And while I'm listening to your talk and I'm just trying to think about the alternative, and I'm glad that you actually had the last question, because I was like, should we just abandon the word in itself, like just altogether? Because it's the same thing as sustainability has been greenwashed a lot by in this industry. And my inclination is always to say, like, academic, we have to create a counter narrative. But when it's being really like widely used in I would say wrong way, unsustainable way, then is there a need to have another new concept to capture what we actually want to say? And then we're gonna take another a couple of decades to educate people what it means. So that was kind of my current thought so far. But I actually have a questions there, and it's a genuine question. It was not a kind of trying to challenge, but then from your perspectives, how do you see the circular society works? Let's say circular of power, for example.
Yeah, well,
do you understand what I'm asking?
yes. Well, I think it depends on the literature, right? But essentially, if you can coalesce, what I tried to do there is essentially is getting the gist of what the literature was proposing in that circular society side of the literature, I would say. Essentially proposing democratic mechanisms to govern and control basically the way that we distribute environmental goods and bads and societal goods and bads, right? So redistributing power is essentially seen as at least twofold. One is democratic mechanisms within the political structure. So participatory budgeting, deliberative councils, citizen councils of randomly selected citizens that deliberate on, for example, the new climate plan, as Extinction Rebellion has been asking, as France did last year. Participatory budgeting processes, as I just mentioned, that have actually exist in something like 2,500 cities in the world. Of course, now they only have about 10% of the city budget, right? But if they are given like the whole city budget or 70%, and really makes transformative change. So that's the things that cycle power. Yeah.
So can I ask a follow-up question on that? Because a lot of, I mean, I was also hearing what before some comments about the in opposition of the people in the political right spectrum, and more like practicality. Do you see, not necessarily from the literature, but do you see, or let's say if we envision it together, do you see it's a circular of power, or do you think it's a polarized society because the discourse becomes so fragmented and everyone wants to grab a piece of the power I mean, I would say like in the democratic society now, in terms of how information was being spread, and that kind of lead to, it's a decentralized way of sharing information, but it also leads to some unintended consequences, which is we don't know what is truth anymore. And so that's where I'm coming from and asking kind of, what do you think would happen, or how can it happen?
Yeah, well, that's part of the lack of circulation of knowledge too, is it? You know, if knowledge was more widespread in the sense of information and capacity to understand it, I think people would be more aware of those limitations, right? You can't really redistribute power without redistributing knowledge.
Yes, but so this is the problem of how do we close that loop, right?
Yeah,
before
definitely.
And in education, we keep talking about educating people more so that we can close that loop. But now in education, I see like, are we doing something wrong here? I think we're not closing that loop. We're stretching the line.
Oh yeah, definitely. I absolutely agree. I mean, the education system, and many parts of it is actually built specifically to stretch that line. It's you know, the competitiveness ingrained in the whole way that we think about, you know, like already, you know, putting one kid against the other, you know, with grades and you know, achievements and awards, and the whole way that we think in a utilitarian fashion about what has to be taught, what not, you know, about what kind of you know, education matters and whatnot, you know, you're not taught to be a good person. You're taught to be like an efficient, well-producing citizen, and that's a very different thing. And obviously, in any case, it's clear that right now, because there are not kind of the right education, there are limitations. But I think most people, at least research has found that most people in many countries actually prefer a degrowth-oriented sustainability transition and circular future rather than pro-growth one. So there's been two very kind of interesting surveys that were published recently where they asked French people what kind of ecological future they would prefer. And one of those was the degrowth, another one was green growth, and the last one was about like, going back to like traditional kind of Christian values and like regionalism. So kind of a little bit of a fortress circular economy kind of proposition. And at the end, the one that won by a huge margin was the degrowth one, like by a huge margin, and in two really respectful research. So I think the democratic process now, like the structure of power now within society, does not reflect people's opinion. I mean, I think it's pretty clear. It's you know, the way that we've decided to structure elections, to representatives, and the way that elections are thought through a process where money basically makes a huge difference, impedes any form of circularity in terms of redistribution of power and wealth. It's absolutely clear. And I mean, if the concept of circular anything is anything useful to me is if you circulate wealth and power, because circulating resources is not very, you know, it's not very creative. You know, it's like anybody, you know, we've been talking about circulating resources sustainably since quite a long time, and it hasn't made much of a difference. And so if we are to use the, I think, metaphor of circulating anything, it has to be about that, you know, circulating power. Yeah, anyways, what do you guys think about that that metaphor yeah,
What metaphor now?
like,
do you mean the no, just repeat, I'm not sure.
like, yeah, what do you guys think about that metaphor? But most importantly, perhaps, what do you guys think about the possibility, considering the fact that a lot of people actually might prefer like a degrowth-oriented future, the possibility of bringing about that change?
Okay, so are you talking about the metaphor of circular economy society?
Yes, circular
okay.
societies in the sense of redistributing power, you know.
Yeah.
I
Elaine,
actually think if you give people the choice, people would choose degrowth. But if you start discussing what would be the consequences of what that means, then it's a different discussion. And I think people are very good at saying yes to socially in a social norm. People think it's a common good, but when it comes to really has an impact on self, not a criticism to human. I think it's a very natural thing, as we can see now, how people are dealing with COVID, right? When it has an impact on yourself, then there's a second thought of, what does it mean? And and I do agree that current political system is not sustainable or is not circular in a way that actually allowing the voice or majority or different voice being treated equally or being heard. So there are like a couple of different democratic model, like liquid democracy, for example, all these kind of different ways of thinking are trying to come out. But it always comes down to resources. And I know that you mentioned about, materially speaking, circular economy is not that interesting. I remember I went to several conferences and kind of, especially engineers. And when you ask engineer, you're turning the circle, you say that your process is circular, but what is the starting point there? Like, it's still there's some material coming from somewhere. It doesn't, because you draw a circle, it's a circle. But then in order to have social, that's it. Even just when we're doing research, participatory process take time and take a lot of resources, and this is not undeniable. And where those resources coming from, where this money coming from, where these time coming from, then probably it's my naivety, but I'm more like throwing the question back to you to kind of like explain my skepticism into the sort of closing that loop. I do like the concept of circular, but how is it practical without considering the resources that need to put into that? Also, the consequences of degrowth.
Yeah.
I think maybe also it would interest me actually, Elaine, what you think the consequences of degrowth would be. But maybe I can just first give some thoughts on what you've been talking about. So, for example, circulating power, which in my eyes is of course also like essential in the sense if we want to create a different system, a different way of functioning, it's clear there needs to be much more participation from larger society instead of keeping certain elites at the top that are just, taking decisions partly for themselves. And this, I think maybe in this conversations is also interesting to become a bit more specific about how we think that could work and what that would mean. Like, I don't really have a specific answer on that, but something that I have found quite interesting to explore is really like this much more localized, decentralized sort of system, which then of course goes also a lot against the whole globalization that we're seeing. But like you do have also, I guess, some trends to apply governance on a more local level based on what is really needed and wanted there. Rather than have this very central big system. And then, especially more direct democracy types. And I think there are some places where there has been a lot of experimenting with different forms of governance and what that would mean for society. So I definitely think that it's possible. Whether we can shift quickly to like a circular, or transformational circular economy, for example, to like more like degrowth or something, that I don't know. I think that to some extent, maybe people need to even realize more what climate change and all these issues mean, and like what devastating consequences this will have in the future. And maybe at some point people are up for trying something radically different. I feel like right now we're very stuck in this failure of the imagination where no one really, like, everyone can imagine the end of the world more than the end of capitalism, but like I think at some point when people realize that it's just not working. It's just not working. Maybe it would be possible to switch to a different sort of system. But yeah, many thoughts on this. Elaine, what are the like negative consequences in your eyes of degrowth?
Well, it depends on degrowthing from at which level, right? If we're talking about degrowthing in the wealthy countries now, I mean, definitely not the wealthy people in wealthy countries are degrowthing, right? That's first. If we're talking about degrowth as the planet, like everyone in the world, then of course, again, the already marginalized group are gonna be hit the most, because this is not a fair solution to ask all countries and everyone to degrowth. So then we comes to the next step of, okay, then what's the mechanism of degrowthing? Who's need to degrowth and who's responsibility to degrowth? Let's say this. How do we decide? And then become a circular question of like, wow, like this is a social equity problem. Then we have to first solve the, and I'm basically talking about SDGs now, right? Then we have to first solve about the development problems, social problems, then we can talk about degrowth. And then then another decade, and then I don't know. It's just, that's my thought. Yeah.
And to be fair to the degrowth literature, though, I think the degrowth has never been conceived as something that the South should do in the sense of, at least in the economic sense, right?
Yes,
so,
I agree. But then, Sarah, you're also mentioning about, it's not only the economic sense when we're talking about degrowth. For example, population, right? Like that is another different concept of degrowth. When Sarah, you're giving example about your friend, like why are they having 8 kids? And then, you know, it's a form of degrowthing itself. So degrowthing what as well? I agree. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's another problem with the word degrowth. I think it can very easily be understood in a way that becomes very imperialist, you know. But I think if you look at the literature clearly, that's not what they mean, right? And they're actually very clear that that's not what they mean. You know, they go at lengths to prevent that from being what they mean.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The way I've also understood it is that it's really sort of economic growth which we're talking about, and mostly like degrowing the economies that are already overly consumerist, you know. And I don't like, I mean, I think that it's definitely I'm not the most familiar with degrowth literature, but from what I've understood, it's definitely targeted at the global north, and sort of saying like, we don't need to grow anymore. We actually need to grow less, so that countries that have much less than the global north can there can be this redistribution of resources, because there's this huge flow of resources towards the global north, which is just maintaining an overly resource intensive lifestyle, which is not sustainable in the long term. And I think degrowth is not saying we have to be less people, but it is saying let's consume less so that we can have more people and everyone can be comfortable, and we have enough resources for that. But in order to do that, we need a lot of change in the way a lot of people live and our whole economic system.
So
and yeah,
I understand the literature definition of degrowth, but I think what I was saying before was more about how, if we want everyone to be on board this kind of concept, it's often I received as well, like counter argument to say, well, degrowth meaning what? Like I don't understand any literature, but then, but I understand what you mean. So there's an interesting point that you're mentioning, Sarah, because just look at last year, COVID, and I would say living in Canada, it was a degrowth moment economically. The impact on society is tremendous. Like, and it struck me how unsustainable our economic is as well. Like, just very fast, you start seeing a lot of mental problem, a lot of homelessness on the street right away. and a lot of people losing job or relying on government benefits. And as a person who is doing work in sustainability, I start to really become aware of, wow, like pushing the idea doesn't mean that, I mean, a person pushing idea also has a responsibility to think about the unintended consequences. And I think that was where my question was coming from, because I saw that in front of my face. Such suddenly the degrowth and the carbon footprint and so many news about air become clear, but then the impact right away on the more socio-economically less benefit community, or just like regular people losing jobs, and then that impact like make me afraid. Let's put it this way.
Once again, I have to say that I think it's pretty unfair to call that degrowth. I mean, it's valid in a sense, like in a strict way, because the economy went into recession, but technically that's a recession. It's not degrowth, right? So I think that's why I think we always forget degrowth is a post-capitalist economy. Like a degrowth society is a post-capitalist society, because in a capitalist society, you need growth. You have no choice but to have growth. So essentially, we cannot think of a degrowth society within the confines of our system.
So can you help me, can you explain or clarify for me a little bit, like differences between the degrowth is different from recessions? And because when I'm thinking about degrowth, I was probably thinking about also less consumerism, less focusing on economic prosperity, like those kind of things. And you think that wouldn't lead to necessary recession? I don't know the definition of recession at this point anymore.
But it's not a recession anymore. The thing is, because I mean, of course, in strict terms, the GDP would fall, but you would also not care. It would be completely inconsequential, because the thing is, the system in which we are now depends on GDP in order to obtain taxes, resources that are then distributed throughout society, mostly in the forms that benefit the middle, upper middle, and higher classes, but in parts, in ways that benefit lower classes, and with jobs and social programs and etc. And anyway, the structure of a system also depends on growth, in the sense that if there is no growth, companies fail because they can't always compete all the time. Like, you have to have room for expansion of the economy. Otherwise, companies just collapse because they can't pay back their owners that expect dividends, and they expect the company to grow by 5, 4, 6% every year, so that they and also pension systems depend on growth. Banks depend on growth. They wouldn't even give you a loan if you weren't telling them that you're going to pay them a bit more than you gave them. So the entire structure of capitalism is basically, you give capital, money, you with that capital, you produce something, and then you sell it again for more money. That's the whole structure of it, right? And you have to always use your money to make more money, right? Essentially, thus grow the economy. Now, another economy will therefore have to work on a completely different premise. Perhaps the most developed structure, technically speaking, of a non-growth dependent economy is a eco-socialism. It's definitely something very different from Soviet or Chinese state communism. And that is pretty clear, because state communism in both China and the USSR was still very much a materialist, productivist system. That is still founded on growth in another way, in the sense that it was fighting against the US and try to increase military arsenal, and also increase the resources of its ruling class, because there was no real democracy, tangible democracy within the system, right? And well, there still isn't, obviously, in China. Now, the thing is, in a degrowth society, you would generally provide all social services for free. So transport, education, healthcare, and etc., housing. And the market would be still there, and that's not inconsistent with socialism. Capitalism is a system where the market is everywhere and where the market is owned by private ownership, which means that the workers don't own the means of production. It's not the owner, the workers that are themselves the proprietors of, for example, a small restaurant, small, I don't know, Thai restaurant, something, you know, it's not a capitalist structure per se. Capitalist structure is when you have people that are working in an economy that they don't benefit from directly, right? That are employed. So in any ways, you can still have a market where all companies are essentially directly owned by their workers. One share, one vote, you know, and one person, one share, one vote, to make it easy. Anyway, so you can build that, and that does not depend on growth.
So then that's interesting, because listening to you, and I'm just wondering, are we actually just describing donut economy then?
Donut?
Yeah, the this kind of like.
I don't think donut economy goes as far, because
Okay.
I don't think it is aware of its post-capitalist nature and that implications of that. I think the donut economy is very much structured in a way that is a reform of the current system, but it is not a move to another system. So, and it's very clear about being growth agnostic. It isn't degrowth. The problem is we can't be agnostic about growth. We can't simply be agnostic. We have to be, and also it is clear, and it's very depoliticized also, the donut model, in the sense that it is not anti-capitalist in a very direct way. It doesn't say it's a post-capitalist world. And unfortunately, if you want to be serious about a society that doesn't depend on growth, you also unfortunately have to face the conceptual and tangible consequences. And I think that's what I thought that's what you were talking about, like in the sense that the impacts of degrowth is that you have to change the system. And that's not something you can do like this, you know, because you're in a global economy. How are you going to, unless you're Russia, and you basically own like enough land to like live on for the next 2,000 years, because, you've got iron, you've got copper, you've got oil, you've got uranium, you've got nickel, you've got everything. You've got, being Russia is very easy to create a Soviet economy. Well, in that case, it was a failure and it was crazy. But in any case, if you're a country like France, for example, you have no resources. How are you going to obtain stuff? How are you going to obtain? So at the end, post-capitalist thinking has always been an international movement, in the sense that it needs to happen everywhere. You need to fight the neoliberal globalization in every country, because if only one country does it, then essentially it will be ostracized and destroyed by the rest.